successful and a holding against at all times.
Be careful!
Government officials insist that this is isolated incident different from the second experience.
It was the November of 2011 when Latoya Amons and her 3 children moved into their new home in Gary, Indiana. Her mother, Rosa Campbell, accompanied her to the quaint home at 3860 Carolina Street, all excited for a fresh start. Everything started off wonderfully, everyone enjoying a new start in a new life, but it didn't take long for the cracks to form, because that December, strange and unexplainable things began to occur throughout the home. Latoya was the first to notice peculiar happenings. The new house had a screened-in porch, but somehow, large swarms of black flies inexplicably began to appear despite the cold winter temperatures. Latoya and Rosa would eliminate the flies each day, but the next morning they somehow reappeared, and every time there seemed to be more and more of them. This troubling activity went on for a few weeks, but one day, out of nowhere, it just stopped. The family didn't understand how or why, but they were so grateful to no longer be bothered by the flies, no one questioned it, and they went back to enjoying their new home and new life. Unfortunately, this joy would be short-lived, as they would probably prefer the flies over what was to come. The next strange occurrence to disturb the family struck at midnight. Every night at midnight. You see, every evening, while they all lay in bed, they would be disrupted by the sound of footsteps coming up from the basement. Frozen in fear, Latoya and Rosa listened in as footsteps grew louder and closer, steadily ascending the basement stairs. When they reached the top, the locked basement door to the kitchen would slowly creak open. Yet whenever they investigated the eerie noises, all they found was the basement door standing ajar, revealing the obsidian abyss below. These events quickly chipped away at the new peace the family had, but any remaining peace was about to be shattered. One evening in the dead of night, the sounds were not coming from the basement, but from Rosa's closet. Rosa was suddenly awakened by the sound of her closet door slowly opening. She rolls over in bed to see what could have possibly opened the door, only to see a disturbing, towering silhouette. The spectral shadow stepped out of her closet and drifted through the doorway into the family room. She paused only for a moment in disbelief before flying out of bed to follow the shadowy invader. She caught up with it in the living room, only to witness this dark, imposing figure going back and forth, as though pacing through the family room. It now seemed less ethereal than it was upstairs. She stood frozen, not breathing, her mind flooding with questions. Who is this? What is this? Why is it here? What does it want from us? She calmed her mind, realizing she had to do something about the intruding presence. She rushes to the light switch and turns it on, welcomed mockingly by an empty room. The figure vanished in an instant. Confounded and full of fear, she was determined to know more about what just happened. She investigated the living room, desperately hoping for answers, but perhaps regretted having them after what she stumbled upon. When she reached the place in the room where the entity was pacing back and forth, she almost fainted when she saw a trail of massive, wet boot impressions on the carpet. She began to rehearse the event in her mind. One minute it seemed like a spirit, the next like a man, but either way, one thing was sure. It couldn't have been a hallucination because it left physical evidence, right? By March of the following year, things had calmed down, fear downgraded to discomfort. The family appreciated the inactivity but lived each day kind of waiting for something to happen, waiting for the other shoe to drop, the same sensation that comes from winding a jack-in-the-box slowly. They were right to feel this way, but what waited on the other side of that feeling would be unlike anything they had experienced thus far. By the very end of the second week, on March 10th, things took a startling turn. That day, the family had the misfortune of hosting a wake. Everyone was in a state of grief, having lost a loved one, including some extended family and some friends that had come to visit. The ceremony went well into the night. It was about 2 a.m. when grief would turn to terror. Out of nowhere, a scream resonated through the house. It was Latoya. She let out this blood-curdling scream for her mother. Rosa ran into her room where everyone was in shock. As Latoya screamed, she and her daughter's friend stared in shock as the 12-year-old girl was unconsciously levitating above her covers. Rosa calmed everyone and called everyone to the room. They gathered around the bed and were instructed to pray. It appeared to work because as the friends and family prayed, Latoya's daughter slowly came back down to the bed. They were relieved she was no longer levitating, but no one had any clue as to how this happened or why it was happening to them at all. When the young lady woke up, she had no idea either, as she couldn't even remember that it happened. It was incredibly late and everyone was feeling overwhelmed by the loss and from the strange event that unfolded. The friends and family left for the night, but many of them decided that this was the last time they would set foot in that house on Carolina Street. In a scenario befitting a horror movie, their dream home had truly become a nightmare. But for the Amons family, this was no movie. Sadly, it was no bad dream they could simply wake up from. This was real life, and it was about to get realer. With no answers, no support from family, they didn't know what to do. It was clear to them that there was no natural explanation for what they were facing, so they sought supernatural and spiritual help. Mother and daughter began knocking on the doors of several churches in the region of Gary. Sadly, they were turned away by most of them. On the verge of giving up, they tried one more church and finally found one willing to hear them out. They explained what had been going on the last few weeks that culminated with the levitation at the wake. They were relieved to be believed, but they were disturbed by the conclusion. The pastor of the church told them that what they were dealing with sounded undeniably demonic. Latoya and Rosa were informed that the home must be occupied by an evil spirit or spirits. They were instructed to thoroughly clean the home, so they did. With the obnoxious smell of chemicals permeating the air, the next thing they were told to do was anoint the children with oil. They placed oil on their foreheads, making the sign of the cross, and they poured olive oil on their hands and feet. Sadly, they did not stop here. Rather than wait to see if these things would bring any type of relief, the two then sought two spiritualists claiming to be clairvoyant. The psychics told them that there were 200 demons in the home. They said plan A should be to relocate entirely and immediately. But having used all their resources to get into the home, turning around and moving wasn't in the cards. So the clairvoyants said to go with plan B. This plan involved constructing an altar in the basement. They followed their instructions to a T. They placed a small table in the center of the basement covered by a white sheet. On the table, they put a candle alongside images of the Holy Family, small nativity statues of Mary, Joseph, and Jesus. In addition to the altar, Latoya and Rosa were instructed to cover the basement with salt. Many belief systems attribute salt with the powers of spiritual protection. With walls covered and altar made, Latoya and one of her friends dressed all in white and carried out the final step of the psychic's plan. Once all the preparations were made, they were told they needed to conduct a cleansing ritual. This ritual involved the burning of sage as well as sulfur throughout the entire home, including the basement. They were told to read Psalm 91 while making the sign of the cross and smoke throughout each room. Latoya and her friend did everything to the letter. For 3 days, it seemed like the nightmare was over. But after the third day, they found the nightmare had only just begun. A major shift occurred when Latoya noticed that her kids began acting severely out of character. She would find them speaking in deep, menacing tones. Their often adorable smiles carried a sinister twist to them at times. Their mouths seemed extended and their eyes appeared to bulge abnormally. They would have these episodes where their behavior and mannerisms were entirely out of the ordinary, as though not Latoya's children at all. She would then see their demeanors shift again, shoulders and face at rest, voices normalize, and when she asked them about what she saw, they never had any idea what she was talking about. Most disturbing of all, perhaps, was Latoya's youngest son. The little boy could be found sitting in his closet and seemingly talking to someone that only he could see. He would say that there was another little boy, and this little boy would say things like,
"I've been here long enough. I came to kill, and I'm going to kill."
The invisible little boy would also vividly describe death to Latoya's son, claiming it was his own. One day when the youngest son was in the closet, he shocked everyone when it appeared as though he was chucked out of it. As though the closet vomited him out, he slammed into his sister, who was then thrust into her headboard, and she injured herself to such a degree they had to rush her to get stitches. The poor injured girl was questioned by a psychiatrist at the hospital. She explained to her that sometimes it felt like she was being pinned down and choked at home. She said when this happened, she was unable to move or say a word, but she could hear a voice talking to her. She said the voice was threatening. It would tell her that she was going to die, that she would never see her family again. It turned out that the daughter wasn't the only one having these dreadful experiences, and the incident with the closet wasn't the only time one of the boys would seemingly be thrown without explanation. LaToya had become convinced that she and her kids were being tormented and even possessed intermittently by an evil spirit. LaToya described times when she was alone and her body temperature would shoot up out of nowhere. It would be accompanied by violent shaking, and she would lose consciousness, gain it back, only to lose it again. Not to mention the ceaseless nightmares plaguing her every night. Rosa, the grandmother, saw many things in the home, but she says she never personally had any of these demonic activities happen to her directly. It would get so bad on some nights that LaToya would pack up the kids and go to a hotel just to have some momentary relief. Things just kept spiraling out of control. Still scared and desperate, they decided to take the kids to see a doctor that April. The doctor would later say that as soon as he came into the examination room, he was inexplicably overwhelmed with fear and foreboding. Nothing like this had ever happened to him before. He sat down with the family, and LaToya explained all the family had been going through. Despite her fear and the strange feeling he got upon entry to the room, his notes indicated a lack of belief concerning anything LaToya said. His notes said she was absolutely delusional with her talk of ghosts and hallucinations. That was until the youngest son jumped up and began angrily cussing out the doctor in an otherworldly voice far too deep for a 7-year-old boy. Amid the profane verbal barrage, suddenly the young boy was dramatically lifted from the ground by unseen hands and thrust into the wall. Everyone in the room says not a soul was seen to have touched the boy physically. The little boy fell unconscious. Additional medical staff came to aid him. They attempted to wrestle him awake, but he was totally knocked out. Some reports indicate that one of the office attendants, hearing everything unfold, dialed 911. Paramedics arrived with police officers, and both boys were taken to the emergency room. LaToya arrived shortly after the ambulance. She rushed in and asked if she could anoint the boys with oil, but the medical staff just laughed at her. They wouldn't let her in to see the boys, so she simply began to pray in desperation in the waiting room. It's said that as she began to pray in the waiting room that her sons woke up and all hell broke loose. Her 9-year-old son seemed okay, but the younger one began shrieking loudly and tried to attack hospital staff. It would eventually take 5 adult men to subdue the boy. Another member of hospital staff, after having heard everything that transpired up to that point, assumed the boys were being abused. They believed LaToya must be unwell and projecting these delusions on her children, making them act out. Because of this, they reached out to the Department of Child Services in Gary. A social worker from DCS named Valerie Washington came to investigate the matter and would eventually clear both LaToya and the children. Her report indicated that they were all in good health and found no evidence of abuse. In addition to that, a psychiatrist from the hospital also evaluated LaToya and found no signs of mental illness. Still seeking to understand the family, Valerie Washington gathered the children to interview them further. It was during one such hospital interview that LaToya's youngest boy began growling again as his eyes rolled back into his skull. In that moment, he lunged at his older brother, seizing him by the throat. He was squeezing tightly. They pleaded with him to release his grip, but he refused. The little boy's hands had to be physically pried off his brother's neck. Everyone rested for a little bit and let the dust settle, but later that same day, Valerie, Rosa, and an aunt took the children into a different examination room to interview them further. The youngest boy growled once again. He stared daggers through his brother, then looked him in the eyes and said in a voice not his own,
"It's time to die, and I will kill you."
Rosa attempted to intervene. It was then that the boy knelt down and went full speed directly into his grandmother's abdomen. For no reason, he began ramming his head over and over and over again into her gut as hard as he could. His grandmother Rosa, writhing in pain, grabbed the boy by the hand and repeatedly uttered, "You are not you! You are not you!" At that moment, a warped smile crawled across his face, staring with eyes full of malice and evil. He walked backwards, eyes fixed upon her. Her hands still in his, he kept going backwards, slowly toward the wall. To everyone's shock, as soon as he reached the wall, he still didn't stop. He kept walking backward up the side of the wall all the way to the ceiling of the exam room. Once he reached the ceiling, he dropped down, landing on his feet on the other side of his grandmother, still holding her hand. Everyone stared speechless at the boy for a moment, until Valerie, the social worker, and a nurse named Willie Lee Walker bolted from the room to find a doctor. They tried to tell the doctor what they saw, but he didn't believe it. He thought surely the young boy must have been taking them for a ride. He must be acting out. It must have been some manipulative trick, some strange display of athleticism. They brought the doctor in, and he demanded the young boy do the trick again. The young man said he couldn't do it again. He said he couldn't even remember what had happened. The nurse had shared with the social worker that he felt all these activities must have something to do with demonic possession. The social worker was starting to agree with this sentiment, fully believing something spiritual and malevolent was affecting this family, especially the children. The boy was admitted to the hospital, and his mother, Latoya, spent the night with him there. Their grandmother, Rosa, decided to take the other children to stay with a relative outside the home. The following day, everyone returned to the hospital, but they broke Latoya's heart when DCS told her that they were temporarily taking emergency custody of the children. They still believed negative forces were at work, but too many in the system still believed that they were quite natural dark forces, that of abuse and neglect, nothing demonic. The family all wept. The last thing they wanted was to be separated from one another during this crisis. They were heartbroken. They were confused by the actions of the DCS. Why couldn't they see that more was going on here? There was no convincing them, and no recourse as of yet. Eventually, someone reached out to help Latoya and her mother. Unbeknownst to her, the chaplain from the hospital reached out to a priest in the area, someone named Father Michael Maginot, who was from Maryville, Indiana. Though the priest had never done an exorcism before, he was earnest in his desire to help the family through this nightmare. Father Maginot would visit Latoya at her home on Carolina Street. He spent some time getting to know her and her mother, Rosa. Even during his visit, peculiar paranormal things began to occur. They noticed that a light in the bathroom kept flickering rapidly. Rosa pointed it out, and the craziest thing happened. It ceased flickering every time the priest would approach it. Whatever it was, it didn't appear to be fond of him. The discussion would be interrupted again as they noticed that the blinds in the kitchen began swinging back and forth, back and forth. This wouldn't have been a big deal, except there was no airflow in the house. No fans were on, no open doors, no open windows. But the blinds kept moving back and forth on their own. Father Maginot would also notice the wet footprints in the living room that matched neither his nor any of the feet of the current occupants. Also during his visit, Latoya began complaining of a severe migraine, and Maginot thought all of this stuff happening at once was too much to be coincidental. To test his theory, he placed a crucifix on Latoya's forehead, and suddenly she began thrashing about. After having been in the house for a few hours, the priest was thoroughly convinced that this family and this home were dealing with a demonic manifestation of some kind. Somehow demons had occupied the home and were tormenting this poor family. Before leaving, Father Maginot blessed the home, and he insisted it wasn't safe for them to be there. He begged them to leave the home. Latoya and Rosa were convinced by the sincere priest. They packed their bags and decided to move in with a relative. Several days later, the social worker, Valerie Washington, and the Department of Child Services visited the home. They were accompanied by 3 police officers, 2 of which were Captain Charles Austin of the Gary Police Department and Lieutenant Gruska from the Lake County Sheriff's Department. Latoya and Rosa agreed to meet them there while they sought to determine if the home was safe for the children to return. To their shock, Latoya refused to enter the house, so Rosa agreed to do a walkthrough of the home with DCS and the police. A strange interaction occurred while they inspected the basement. Beneath the stairs was an odd patch of dirt. Rosa said that she thought this specific location had something to do with the strange paranormal activity that was plaguing the home. Captain Austin has said that at the time he believed in ghosts but didn't believe in demons. He has since said all that changed after going to the Amons house. While conducting their investigation, the officers noticed that several of their electronic devices began to malfunction. One of the officers was recording the audio from the visit, and they say that when they played it back, there was a strange voice whispering on the recording that clearly wasn't anyone who was there that day. Then there were the photographs they took in the home. They had inexplicable shadows and silhouettes in the background, especially the photos they took whilst in the basement around the strange patch of dirt beneath the stairs. In those photos, there was this strange white mist. When they zoomed in upon it, it appeared to have a face in it. In another photo, a strange green mist appeared with a different face in it. The captain and lieutenant swore up and down that there was nothing and no one in the basement with them when they took those photos. The captain was shaken up enough by the strange feelings and occurrences from the Amons' home, but he was truly rattled when strange activities followed him to his house. He says his radio began malfunctioning on the way home, and when he got home, his electric garage door began to malfunction. It wouldn't open. And when he got back into the vehicle, the electronic seat began to malfunction as well. It was moving irregularly, setting, shifting without pressing any of the buttons. It did this without rhyme or reason, so he urgently took it to a mechanic who informed him the electric motor controlling the seats was fried. The case was growing and ongoing, multiple third parties being dragged in, experiencing the unexplainable, all struggling to come to terms with what was happening. Even though LaToya and the family were living with relatives by this time, a follow-up visit was required at the house on Carolina Street. The previous social worker, Valerie Washington, refused to return to the home, so the case was passed to another social worker, Samantha Illick. Captain Austin and Lieutenant Gruska would go back to the house to accompany Samantha for her inspection. Samantha entered the infamous basement. While down there, she and the officers observed a mysterious liquid dripping on and around the stairs. The family hadn't been in there for 2 weeks, and after searching, they couldn't find anywhere that the substance could be emerging from. Father Maginot was there as well, and he wanted to examine the strange area under the stairs that was emphasized by Rosa. He was curious to see if there were perhaps some cursed items contained there. This could help pin down a definitive spiritual explanation for the dreadful happenings on the property. By this time, Lieutenant Gruska was curious as well, so he began excavating the dirt beneath the stairs by hand. After digging roughly 2 feet down, he made a strange discovery. He found a press-on pink fingernail. He dug a little further and discovered women's underwear. Then a political pin. Further down, the lid from a cooking pot once in the kitchen, as well as a variety of papers from upstairs. They began to suspect that someone or perhaps something had been emerging from the basement, taking items from the main floor and burying them beneath the stairs, potentially for an extended period. When the soil eventually became too compact to dig further, they decided to refill the area and prepare to leave. Before departing, Maginot would bless the basement and spread blessed salt upon the floor. Samantha was feeling spooked after something happened to her hand while in the basement, so the police agreed to finish the investigation themselves. While attempting to wrap up things on the main floor, they noticed a strange substance dripping from the blinds within the screened-in porch. It appeared oily, and even though LaToya and Rosa had been staying with family, the police thought surely she and Rosa must have poured the oil to make the story believable. At least that's what they told themselves at first. They insisted it wasn't them. Gruska cleaned up the substance and told everyone to get out of the house for about a half hour. At the conclusion of the half hour, they returned to the blinds, but so too had the oily substance dripping from them. This gave them pause and made them think back to the substance found in the basement, and everyone was eager to leave. Their fear and confusion prompted them to inquire of the priest about the substance. Father Maginot informed them that the liquid was an otherworldly manifestation caused by the evil spirits in the home. Captain Charles Austin would also take a photo from outside the house while it was empty. The official police photo reveals what appears to be a dark silhouette standing in the screened-in porch area, precisely near the spot where the mysterious oily liquid had been observed dripping from the blinds. Maginot took notes on everything he saw and everything seen by the police and DCS at the time. He intended to ask for permission from the local archbishop to perform an exorcism on LaToya Amons herself. Maginot's initial request was denied. He was instructed to gather further evidence and to consult some priests who had conducted some exorcisms themselves. He had trouble in both regards, so he took it upon himself to conduct a lesser form of exorcism, one that didn't require approval from the archdiocese. What's known as a minor exorcism would be conducted. Minor exorcisms address spiritual oppression, harassment, or attachment, whereas major exorcisms utilize the formal rites and are reserved for cases of confirmed demonic possession. The lesser ritual still involves prayers and appeals for deliverance from the demonic. Maginot knew something had to be done. The day had arrived for the minor exorcism to be attempted. Maginot had asked LaToya and Rosa to both be present, and for safety purposes, asked 2 police officers to accompany them. Maginot began to pray over LaToya. The priest began to invoke the name and power of Jesus to rid the woman of demonic influence. Immediately, she started convulsing and shaking uncontrollably. Maginot saw this as proof of his theory. He didn't think she was merely being influenced by a spirit, but rather she was possessed by one. Little changed after the lesser ritual, so Maginot made note of all that transpired and would once again petition for approval of a full, formal exorcism. Upon his second attempt, the Archbishop granted Maginot the necessary permission to perform the rite of exorcism on Miss Ammons. While awaiting her exorcism, Latoya began researching demons to see if she could learn anything about her tormentors. While researching the demonic, she came across the name Beelzebub, which means the Lord of the Flies. She couldn't help but think back to where the nightmare began, with flies turning up on the porch inexplicably. Maginot would perform multiple exorcisms upon Latoya. He made the first 2 attempts in English, and the third and final attempt that day was performed in Latin. With each ritual, the priests got louder. Latoya's body shook more violently with each ritual. She expressed that she was in incredible pain. She compared it to giving birth, but worse. By the end, it said that Latoya collapsed into a deep sleep. The ritual was over, and so too was her terror and pain. Latoya and her family had moved to a new home in Indianapolis, one that Father Maginot had blessed beforehand. That November, Latoya regained full custody of her kids. DCS continued to check in on the family for about 2 months before the case was officially closed. The final report noted that no demonic activity had been reported by the family in their new home. The children said they felt safe within its walls, and Latoya and Rosa thanked God for helping her family through this horrendous ordeal. As far as we know, the entire Ammons family lives quietly to this day, free from further demonic influence. But what became of the home? Well, 2 years later, in 2014, Zach Bagans purchased the house at 3860 Carolina Street, what became known as the Demon House of Indiana. Zach is a famous modern paranormal investigator and the host of the show Ghost Adventures. He would film a documentary about the Demon House. He felt the building itself seemed to be ensnared by unseen malevolent forces. Zach described the Demon House in the documentary that he created to be one of the most demanding and prolonged investigations he had ever performed, one that left lasting scars on him and on all those involved. During the filming of the documentary, he alleges that he suffered eye damage inside the home. The damage resulted in chronic double vision that requires him to wear specialized glasses to prevent the risk of total blindness to this day. In 2016, Zach's experiences would lead him to decide that the demolishing of the home was the best option, claiming it was far too dangerous to be allowed to stand. Some say this upset Father Maginot, who felt the entity or presence was not properly dealt with and was potentially just released to harm others. The case has now gone by many names: the Ammons family haunting, the Demon House of Indiana, the House of 200 Demons. Whatever you wish to call it, we are left with many things to consider. The severity of the occurrences is startling enough, but greater still is this reality. What is to be made of the testimony not only of the family, but of priests, social workers, police officers, nurses, and doctors, all touched directly and indirectly by this case? But we're not done yet. We have one more case to consider today before diving into our analysis, perhaps biting off more than we can chew, but I think I owe it to you after Thanksgiving. We're off to another small city in the American heartland, again the last place you'd expect to find a powerful Mesopotamian demonic being. But if you ask some, in the 1980s, that's exactly what happened in Oklahoma City. It started with a young man named Darren Evans, your typical 80s teenager who loved hanging out with his friends and meeting girls. Around 1982, he would hook up with a girl from school named Brandy, and as you do when you're in high school, they hung out whenever they could. Darren was hanging out at Brandy's one day when a plumber was doing some work underneath her house. He found something peculiar while working on the pipes down there. Deep under the home, buried beneath some dirt, was an old Ouija board. The board had 4 filthy jars on top of it, one on each corner. The plumber brought up the jars and the Ouija board to give to the family, believing it was just some quirky kids' activity. Darren and Brandy received the board, and upon further inspection of the items, things got very dark very quickly. Once the dirt was brushed from the surface of the jars, a startling and disturbing discovery was made. The jars that were sitting upon the board contained the dead and decaying bodies of 4 blackbirds, and they were surrounded by dry blood and rot. After removing the creepy jars from the surface of the board, Darren says that he felt a strange feeling the moment his fingers touched the board itself. He had an overwhelming desire to inspect the board further and perhaps more. Brandy nor her family had any idea where the board came from. This would only increase Darren's curiosity. Days after the unusual board was unearthed, Darren would throw caution to the wind and attempt to use the mysterious board to contact the dead. He decided that he would attempt to communicate with the dead rocker, Ronald Belford Scott, famously known to the world as Bon Scott, a former lead singer for the Australian rock band AC/DC. Famous, of course, for singing the infamous song Highway to Hell, the singer had died 2 years prior due to alcohol poisoning. Darren laid out the board one night. He decided to light some candles, put the planchette on the board, he placed both hands upon it, and began his first ever session with it. He immediately got that strange feeling again when connecting with the board. He felt an odd connection to it. He cried out and waited for 30 minutes for something to happen, and as soon as he was ready to call it a night, the planchette began to move. It slowly made its way across the board to the letter Z. It then took him to the opposite side of the board, to the letter O. Shocked and bewildered, Darren removed his hands. But you see, this didn't stop the planchette from continuing. All on its own, it went from Z to O, Z, O, Z, O. Faster and faster, the planchette went back and forth to these two letters, Z, O, Z, O, Z, O. Darren concluded it was spelling Zozo. He had no idea who or what a Zozo was, and deeply unsettled by what he saw, he grabbed the planchette to quickly end the session. He was told that you should end a session with a Ouija board by saying goodbye. So this is what he did. He was done, but the board, or Zozo, wasn't done yet. The planchette, once again moving on its own, spelled out the phrase, "See you in hell." After completing the final word, the planchette flew across the room. The night ended, Darren running from his room, his heart gripped with fear and confusion. His blood pressure eventually went down. He calmed himself and returned to his room, thinking the strange encounter was finished. He had said goodbye, right? He may have been finished with the board, but the board and whoever or whatever contacted him through it was just getting started. After that horrible night, Darren began having horrendous nightmares accompanied by night terrors. He would frequently wake up, but he couldn't move a muscle. He couldn't say a word, but he would hear words being whispered into his ears. Eventually, the terrifying experiences were not limited to the evenings. Soon Darren would be stalked by the sensation that someone or something was watching him 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Bizarre bangs and knocks could be heard throughout his home at all hours of the day as well. Darren was now desperate to understand what was happening to him. Since it all started with the board, he thought it only made sense to return to the board for answers. So he made the faithful decision to hold additional sessions with the board, a decision that would have great ramifications. He says that things only got more intense and peculiar every time. The banging and knocking once heard in the walls developed into a terrifying moaning that would haunt his evenings. But that would be the least of Darren's nocturnal issues. The haunting sleep paralysis he suffered only increased in severity. He'd wake up incapable of moving. He felt as though something was sitting on his chest, and he wanted to scream, but he couldn't utter a word. All of these strange events forced Darren inward. He began to isolate himself from his friends and family. He kept the Ouija board hidden in his closet in a purple silk cloth, and despite how bad it made him feel, he couldn't resist its call. His initial fascination became an obsession and later an addiction. The experiences got worse and made him feel worse, but he couldn't stop going back to the Ouija board. He couldn't stop returning to Zozo. All his relationships with people were changing. His family and friends were concerned for his well-being. They sensed his reclusiveness growing. There were times that they would lose track of him for days. His relationship with the board was changing as well. He would put it in its place, but at times when the desire for a session would occur, it wouldn't be where he left it. This was strange enough, but to make matters worse, Darren says the board would randomly appear at times when he didn't want to initiate a session, as if taunting him like Bane. "Do you feel in charge?" Darren didn't feel as though he was using the board. He felt as if the board was using him. This went on for years, and eventually Darren would be joined in these sessions by some of his friends, namely his best friend Randy. Though Darren would be relieved to prove that he wasn't out of his mind, he would later regret sucking Randy into this black hole. Randy had always shared in Darren's love for AC/DC, and his favorite band member had also been the late singer Bon Scott, an individual who probably wasn't a great role model for either young man, especially considering one of his biggest hits spoke of hell as the promised land, full of his friends, while proudly declaring he was on the highway to hell. By this time, Darren and Randy were out of school. Darren had his own place. He was doing construction work. On one job site, he made an interesting discovery, much like the plumber at his old girlfriend's house when he was a boy. While digging, he discovered a filthy jar. He picked it up to throw it away as to not have to deal with broken glass on the site, but it looked oddly familiar. He brushed off the dirt and filth from the surface of the jar, and his heart stopped. He saw what was inside. It was a bloodied, rotting blackbird. Just like the 4 that were found years ago under Brandy's house on the top of the Ouija board. He knew that it couldn't be chance, he knew that it must be occult-related, and he knew that it must be related to the mysterious and infamous Zozo. Despite all the time he spent on that Ouija board, he knew just as little about it now as he did then, and the same was true of Zozo. Several days after his strange find, one night while hanging out in Darren's apartment in 1985, Randy wanted the 2 of them to use the Ouija board again. Both throwing caution to the wind as well, he wanted to see if they could reach Bon Scott, the same desire that started Darren down this dark path years ago. Where had Mr. Scott's highway led him? Darren did what he had done so many times now. He dimmed all the lights in his apartment, placed the board on the table, he lit some candles, and they both grabbed the planchette. They waited with bated breath. After several minutes, the planchette began to move. Randy's heart began racing, and he shouted, "We want to talk to Bon Scott from AC/DC." The planchette's movements increased. It was now moving in a circular pattern around the board. While still in this circular navigation, it began to stop at letters spelling out a phrase. A-Y-E-M-A-T-E. It said, "I, mate." Darren was equally shocked as Randy. This had not happened before. Whoever or whatever was communicating with the boys appeared to be using an Australian dialect, just like the deceased lead singer they admired so much. They asked a few more questions until they were satisfied that they had officially reached the former star. Excited by all the detailed responses they were getting, the board then asked them for something. The board, or whoever was using the board, asked Darren and Randy to light a cigarette and place it within the hole at the top of the planchette. They were pretty creeped out by the request, but also incredibly intrigued. They had to see if something would really happen if they met the request. They looked at each other for a minute. Without saying a word, they lit up a cigarette. They both took a few contemplative drags from the cigarette, but as they exhaled the smoke, out too went any remaining reason, screaming to end the session. They placed the cigarette into the planchette as requested, the glowing side sticking up like a thin candle. They were astonished as the board began to spell once again. T-H-A-N-K-S. Thanks, it said. As the planchette reached the letter S, the tip of the cigarette lit up as though someone had just taken a drag. The boys stared in fascination as the cigarette appeared to be smoked through the planchette on this mysterious board that was unearthed 3 years ago. Once there was nothing left except the butt of the cigarette, the planchette was on the move again. But their boyish excitement and amazement would soon be crushed. The Ouija board spelled out, "F you, Randy. I will have your soul, and I'll see you in hell. Z-O-Z-O." Needless to say, the young men were horrified. They quickly said goodbye to end the session, and Darren chucked the Ouija board out the window of his second-story apartment. Randy's terror and shock gave way to rage. He started hurling insults at Zozo, screaming and swearing, but nothing came of it. Nothing else would happen that night. Someone in the complex returned the Ouija board to Darren's apartment the next day, and things began to spiral out of control for both young men after that evening. Darren's best friend turned to the same vice as their childhood idol. Randy turned to alcohol to cope, and it quickly eroded his life. His wife would leave him and take their son, whom he could only see part-time now. And every time an opportunity presented itself in Randy's life, something happened that slammed the door in his face, further derailing his course. He described it to Darren as an inescapable prison. Others might describe it as a curse. Sadly, neither young man learned their lesson. One night they were hanging out together in 2005 and they decided to get the board out again. Randy once again taking the lead, asking a heavy, morbid question this time. How am I going to die? After a few seconds, the planchette began sliding across the board. In a car at night, alone. Both men sat soberly and stared. 2 years later, the best friends would spend a final evening together. Randy decided to call it a night, and as he left, he said to his childhood friend, Darren, I'll see you in hell. The following morning, Alicia, Randy's girlfriend, frantically called Darren. She informed him that Randy didn't make it home because he died. Apparently, while driving home, Randy got in a terrible accident that night. No one got there until the morning, so he did die in a car at night, alone. Darren's heart sank at the news of losing his best friend and losing him in the same manner as the mysterious board had declared 2 years prior. For most people, this would be the moment that you would flee from anything remotely associated with Zozo and the infamous Ouija board. But Darren wasn't like most people. All of this only served to fuel his obsession and addiction to the board, and soon all things occult-related. Over the years, Darren acquired several Ouija boards and other mystical occultic items. He was determined to learn about Zozo, and he felt this was the best way. He felt he had to know who it was or what it was. Married by this time and with a daughter, they lived in a house in Oklahoma City. His wife Kathleen joined him on this obsessed quest for esoteric knowledge concerning Zozo, a quest that would once again take a very dark turn. One night after laying their daughter to sleep, Kathleen and Darren would initiate a session on the Ouija board, one that Zozo would also attend and sink his claws deeper into Darren and into his life. During the session, something began to change with her husband. Kathleen's heart stopped. It felt as though time had stopped. She was paralyzed in fear as someone or something began to stare at her, but through her husband's eyes. She was looking dead at Darren, but it was not Darren looking back. It was something inhuman. It felt as though it wanted to tear her apart. In an instant, Darren lunged at her. Barely ducking his ravenous approach, she quickly ended the session and said goodbye on the board. Still utterly horrified but unharmed, she turned around and looked at her dazed husband. After a few minutes that felt like hours, Darren finally came to. He looks up at his terrified wife, staring at him in fear with no recollection of what had just unfolded. Thinking they had dodged a bullet, they would soon be sadly mistaken. A simple goodbye on the board wasn't enough to stop the darkness that had been unleashed by them in their home. It started with the chilling experiences Darren had growing up, now beginning to plague his current home and family. As in so many cases, inexplicable knocking could be heard in the home at various times throughout the day. The knocking turned to banging at the walls. Before they knew it, they could hear unsettling footsteps in their home at night. But then there was the dreadful hissing that filled their hearts and their home with fear. Unable to find any natural explanations for these increasingly petrifying experiences, they became so afraid that they essentially barricaded themselves in a room upstairs that they dubbed the safe room. But it turns out just labeling a room as safe does not deem it so. One night while Darren attempted to sleep, the atmosphere of the home shifted. He suddenly was overcome with dread. Without thinking, he ran to the safe room, but the feeling was so heavy he ran back to bring his family with him to the room. He begins crying out to them to wake them up. As he makes his way toward the stairs, he sees his daughter at the foot of them. Before he could get to her, out of nowhere, her feet left the ground. She begins to float through the air, crying out for her father, pleading to be let down as she's taken out of his sight. Darren books it down the staircase, but as he made his way around the corner, she was nowhere to be found. He does a quick search of the first floor, finding nothing, until he begins to hear what sounds like his daughter's muffled screams coming up from the basement. He now runs to the basement. He goes to open the door, but it won't budge. He fights with the doorknob, his daughter's cries fueling him with adrenaline. Seconds later, he forces the door open, and he rushes to his distraught little girl. He takes her and his wife to the safe room on the second floor. They slam the door shut. They embrace and they lay huddled in the corner, shivering in fear as movement and disturbing sounds could be heard throughout the home downstairs. After that night, Darren felt he had to get his wife and daughter out of the house. But his obsession with the occult and Zozo only increased. He would find a new place for his family to reside, but He would also resume his hunt to understand the entity that had plagued him so much for his life. The Zozo rabbit hole went deeper than he could have ever imagined. In 2009, part of his investigative journey brought him to an online forum of the paranormal, where he shared his many interactions and experiences with Zozo. It was then that he discovered he was not alone. It turned out that many had had experiences with this demonic entity that they had also shared on the forum, and Darren began to catalog and compare these experiences on his own website. A common theme amongst the accounts was that Zozo was known to deceive people that it was a deceased friend or family member, or in some cases, like with Darren and Randy, someone notable to the individual. Many reported that sessions started off benign or even welcoming, but before too long things would take a dark turn, and for some, a dangerous one. Darren published a book in the year 2016 entitled The Zozo Phenomenon. In it, he put forth his years of research, his many dark personal encounters, as well as the experiences of dozens of others he gathered via his website. Today, he considers himself a paranormal investigator and a self-proclaimed zoologist, and he's been featured on many paranormal programs and at many events discussing these experiences. I believe one must ask the question, who has a grip on who here? Is Darren holding on to Zozo, or is Zozo holding on to Darren? On his personal YouTube channel as of 2 years ago, he was still participating in sessions with Ouija boards. Some say he must be lying, because who in their right mind would keep going back to things and to places that cause so much pain and distress? Well, for me, living in Washington State, I've come face to face with addiction a lot. There's a biological element to it, a neurological element, environmental factors, and the often neglected spiritual element. I see people returning to things that destroy them on a daily basis. I don't find it hard to believe that Darren might continue to participate in these activities, even if they're not in his best interest to do so. Though he might not appreciate my comparison, I see many parallels with Darren and Zozo, and Darren and the occult, to addiction. If not addiction, a toxic relationship, one that it doesn't matter if you say goodbye, they seem to keep coming back, again, and again, and again. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome back to the Dancing Toaster. It is episode 10. We are in double digits, baby. The big 10. 'Tis I, your host Nelly, pastor and purveyor of the peculiar and paranormal. I hope you had a wonderful Thanksgiving. I thank you once again for joining me on this wild ride. We hit 2,000 after our second month. That is a culmination of downloads on various podcast platforms as well as views on YouTube. To some, it doesn't seem like much. It means the world to me, and I couldn't do it without you. So, thank you once again. You make my heart warmer than the inside of a toaster. Continue to follow, share, subscribe, and like. I hope you liked those 2 wild accounts of demonic possession and oppression. Well, hopefully you didn't like those things, though some might think the Darren guy likes them. I know you found them interesting, let's say that. And now it's time for us to talk a little bit about them. One of the reasons I did so much storytelling this time around is because when it comes to demonic possession, I feel there isn't much I have to do to demonstrate its reality. If you call yourself a Christian and you read the New Testament even a little bit, there is no escaping the reality of demons and the reality of demonic possession. Back in episode 3, we spoke of what demons were ontologically. All fallen angels are demons, but not all demons are fallen angels. Yes, some demons are fallen angelic beings, formerly heavenly creatures in rebellion against Yahweh. In episode 8, we broke down a hierarchy of some of these beings as laid out by Paul in his letter to the Ephesians. Other demons are the disembodied spirits of the dead Nephilim. Again, episode 3 of this first season developed that idea historically and biblically. Even if you disagree with the latter, what isn't up for debate is the fact that demons are malevolent spiritual beings. Beings intent on bringing about fear, pain, and destruction to God's human image bearers. I believe both of our accounts today, if true, are dealing with demonic activity. Though there appeared to be ghost-like elements in both stories, most agree by the end that in these cases it was merely spirits of deception coming in the likeness of either a little boy with the Amon's case or under the pretense of a famous dead guy, like the case of the Zozo phenomenon with Darren. This accounts for much of, but not all, spectral phenomena. Episodes 5 and 6 talked a lot about that. All ghosts are spirits, but not all spirits are ghosts, right? We talked about unique instances potentially involving disembodied human spirits, but again, today has nothing to do with that. I'm just throwing out the caveat for those perhaps joining us for the first time. I don't write off every ghost story as a demon immediately, but given all the data on our 2 cases today, we're dealing with 2 accounts that one might call hauntings caused directly by demonic activity. A home possibly haunted by 200 evil spirits, if the 2 obnoxious psychics are to be believed, and a Ouija board haunted by 1 evil spirit calling itself Zozo. You can also see why we talked about haunted locations in episode 7, haunted objects in episode 8. No, these are all not shameless plugs. Well, maybe a little bit, right? No, I'm trying to show you there's a method to my madness that we are building upon each episode. Can a place be haunted? Yes, Isaiah 13 is where we made the case for that. Can objects be haunted? Yes, in the sense that spiritual beings can work through physical objects in the physical world. We can see good spiritual beings working through objects, like Yahweh working through the ark, or evil spirits working through objects as seen in Mesopotamian occultic practices, ones that Yahweh would condemn in the Law of Moses. So, could the Amon's house be haunted? Well, not anymore because it's been obliterated. Thanks, Zach Bagans, or Baggins, I don't know if that sounds like a hobbit. Zach Baggins, I don't know if it's Bagans. But he destroyed the house, right, wrong, or indifferent, it's gone. But could it have been haunted while LaToya and her family lived there? Yes, there is the possibility that it was haunted. We don't have enough information to say why it was this house specifically. I think it was a low-level demonic entity working at the home. There was no reason for a powerful fallen Elohim to mess with a random family in a random small neighborhood in Gary, Indiana. Look, I'm not trying to speak disparagingly of the Amon's family or Indiana, but these higher-level beings are disrupting kingdoms and nations and governments, not single-mother families in Gary. So we're dealing with a lower-level entity, most likely the disembodied spirit of a dead Nephilim. The desire to use the bodies of others serves to further that point. Another major theological point I want to make from this idea is this. When you are being afflicted spiritually, it is most likely not the devil. It's not the definite article, the devil, Satan. It may be a devil, but not the devil. I'm speaking King Jimmy there a little bit. Devil is often used synonymously with demon. The devil, Satan, is not afflicting you directly in most cases. Right? He's orchestrating large world events, namely the fall of the West right now, I think. He's succeeding in Europe, by the way. Hopefully he loses some ground here in America come January. But when you are being personally afflicted or affected by a malevolent spiritual force, it may be directed by Satan, but it is not Satan doing it. Western Christians give Satan too much credit. Yes, he is a powerful, malevolent spiritual being, but he is not God. He is not omnipotent, omniscient, nor omnipresent. None of the omnis, those are God's attributes, not Satan's. Satan cannot even be in 2 places at once. He's got bigger fish to fry, so he utilizes lower-level beings to carry out his evil tasks at varying levels. Again, in episode 8, we really broke down some of those levels in the hierarchy. I'm not trying to say, oh, nothing is afflicting you or affecting you. Quite the contrary. There may be, it's just not Satan himself, is what I'm saying. We often think too highly of him, thinking he can single-handedly afflict every Christian at every moment in every corner of the globe. He cannot. He's limited. He needs help, and he has a lot of it. The other possibility is we think too highly of ourselves in this. We suffer from what some may call main character syndrome, right? Corny video game, modern vernacular reference, right? I'm only half joking, but what do I mean main character syndrome? We're going through spiritual difficulty and, oh, well, it must be Satan himself afflicting me because I'm so important. When Jesus was here, you want to know who Satan was concerned with? Jesus. He stalked him and looked for moments to bring about his demise. And if he couldn't get to him, he attempted to get at him through his followers. And guess what? It kind of worked. Luke 22 and John 13 say that Satan entered Judas. Now, some of you are thinking, if you've listened to past episodes,
but I thought you said fallen angels can't do that.
Wrong. I didn't say they can't. I said in most cases that they don't. In most cases of possession, it's a disembodied spirit seeking to be bodied. We found out that angels possess and can utilize physical forms on their own, so in most cases they wouldn't need to use someone else's body. But in this case, it was expedient to use a familiar form to bring about Satan's wicked scheme. In the beginning, he appeared in a serpentine form in the garden. Paul warns us now that he can come disguised as an angel of light, right? 2 Corinthians 11. In any case, the point being, Satan is a terrifying spiritual being, to be sure. One that even Michael himself has a healthy fear of, according to Jude 1:9. When interacting with him, he appealed to the strength and authority of the Lord, not his own. So beware of churches that claim to go around telling the devil what to do in the name of Jesus. Do not speak presumptuously to the powers of darkness, least of all Satan. Have some humility when walking in spiritual territory. Spiritual affliction is very real and can be very demonic, but in most cases, for the average Joe Christian, Satan can issue the order, but isn't going to be the one carrying it out. I want to demystify the devil. Yes, he's a big deal. Yes, he's scary. And yes, he's limited and needs lots of help. That's why when dealing with famous possession cases that we read about, you often hear the person or something in the person claimed to be Satan, right? In the case of Roland Doe that we looked at Thanksgiving week, some say, the spirit claimed to be Satan himself. Doubtful. Because again, why would he waste his time with a random adolescent boy in Maryland when he is a finite being? Roland, or Ronald as we know him now because we know his name, probably did have a devil in him, but not the devil in him. Now, some involved with or familiar with the Amon's case think the spirit could have been Beelzebub, the lord of the flies, because of the literal flies that were present for this haunting in the beginning. But Beelzebub is an interesting word etymologically. Beelzebub is the Greek version of the Hebrew Baal-zebub. It does mean lord of the flies, by the way. There are those that say that it's merely a polemic term, a derogatory and purposeful mispronunciation of another word. They say that Baal-zebub is likely a derogatory version of Baal-zebul, a word that means exalted Baal or Lord of the high place. This sounds like a good explanation until you find out that Baal-zebub is used in 2 Kings 1. It does sound pretty clear that he's a pagan god worshipped in the Philistine city of Ekron. And guess what? There has since been archaeological finds, excavations that were performed in ancient Philistine cities, and within them we have uncovered golden images of flies. Little gold fly statues, basically. To my Warhammer fans, Baal-zebub is basically Nurgle. The Lord of the Flies has also been referred to as the Lord of Filth and Decay, because when you think of a dead body, you think of flies around it. Flies are often associated with death and decay. Where disease is found, flies are often found, and in the mind of the ancients, a deity may take on appearances or characteristics of the thing they are meant to have part in or to help with. Fertility beings are often hypersexualized, right? A god meant to help with disease may take on the appearance of an entity associated with disease, so on and so forth, hence the fly imagery. This was not limited to the Philistines, by the way. Khepri is the Egyptian god that has the head of a fly. God sent a plague of flies upon the Egyptians, not only to judge them, but to judge Khepri. The later part of Exodus 12:12 says this, "I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt, for I am the Lord." So, do I believe that Baal-zebub was purely polemic? Was it a made-up term meant to insult a pagan deity? Though this behavior was common in Jewish literature and thought, I don't believe that's what we see going on with this being. Given the evidence culturally and archaeologically, having a lord of flies seems odd to us, but not to the ancients. Was he a real being? Of course. We've said this in countless episodes. Deuteronomy 32, 1 Corinthians 10 makes this abundantly clear. The gods of the other nations are actual spiritual beings, but they are malevolent ones in rebellion against Yahweh. Deuteronomy 32, 16 and 17. They made him jealous with strange gods. With abominations they provoked him to anger. They sacrificed to demons who were not God, to gods whom they had not known, new gods who had come lately, whom your fathers did not dread. And there's, of course, the New Testament counterpart, 1 Corinthians 10, 19 and 20. What do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No. I imply that when pagans sacrifice, they offer to demons and not to God, and I do not want you to participate with demons. So, Baal-zebub, real entity? Yes. Was this being in Gary, Indiana in the 2000s? Well, we can't say that with certainty, right? One way or the other. We can't say, yes, it was, or no, it was not. There are beings that are over certain geological areas. Others do not appear to be limited in that way. I'm inclined to say that it wasn't that specific entity, but one posing as him, one pretending to be him. In the same way that a pseudepigraphical literary work will have the name of someone important to promote the text, I believe lower-level demons pretend to be the scarier, higher-level ones all the time. Hence why so many would claim to be Satan, right? If I say, "Beware, my name is Bill," ooh, you're not so scared, right? Bill, not so scary. If I say, "Beware, my name is Baalzebub," ooh, well, there's a name that carries some weight, right? Well, maybe you're not so scared of that name because it sounds funny to us now, but it carried spiritual weight. Bill, not so much. Sorry to my friends named Bill out there. Again, why would a powerful, fallen Mesopotamian being occupy the unassuming home of a random single mother in Gary, Indiana? We treat the powers of darkness like they're stupid or something. Far from it. They're brilliant, and they've had thousands of years to learn and perfect their crafts and knowledge. What's one thing we know for sure about demonic entities? Well, they're all liars. Jesus warns us in John 8, Satan has nothing to do with the truth. He says that the truth is not in him. And what does he call him? He calls him the father of lies. So what would his followers, or his children in this case, enjoy and be really good at? Lying. That's why we should really be hesitant to believe information that we receive from any of these entities in any circumstances. Final thought about Baalzebub specifically. 2 Kings mentions him a few times. Then we get to the New Testament, and there's a Greek word that sounds similar that often gets treated or translated the same. We see it in places like Luke 11 where Jesus casts out a demon. Luke 11:14-20 says this. Now he was casting out a demon that was mute. When the demon had gone out, the mute man spoke, and the people marveled. But some of them said, "He casts out demons by Beelzebul, the prince of demons." While others, to test him, kept seeking from him a sign from heaven. But he, knowing their thoughts, said to them, "Every kingdom divided against itself is laid waste, and a divided household falls. And if Satan also is divided against himself, how will his kingdom stand? For you say that I cast out demons by Beelzebul. And if I cast out demons by Beelzebul, by whom do your sons cast them out? Therefore they will be your judges. But if it is by the finger of God that I cast out demons, then the kingdom of God has come among you." First of all, Jesus is a boss. They say, "Oh, well, you cast out demons by the demonic powers." And he's like, "Well, if that's how it's done, then how do your exorcists do it?" Holy clapback. But that's not why we came here, as fun as that is. They say specifically that he casts out demons by Beelzebul, the prince of demons. Baalzebul was the Hebrew that meant Lord of the high place, but the Greek usage of Beelzebul was the polemic play on words by the Second Temple period that meant Lord of dung. So this was trash talk. This was meant as an insult to Satan. By the Second Temple period, Beelzebul was used as a derogatory epithet of Satan. So is there a separate being that is the prince of demons? No, I don't believe so. I don't think that's what it's saying, the way that Jesus uses the terms interchangeably. I think this is Satan. The New Testament does tend to highlight his role and high position in the hierarchy of the kingdom of darkness. So Beelzebul is synonymous with Satan and was a common polemic term used of him by this time period. So the flies were meant to inspire fear, and they were successful in that regard in Gary, Indiana. They were used seemingly as a calling card of a higher being associated with flies, a demonic spirit posing as Baalzebub, a former Philistine god. Concerning all the other activity in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, we see a demon causing its host to harm themselves. We saw this potentially in the case of Roland Doe and possibly in the Amon's case as well. We also see supernatural strength as he was able to break the chains they attempted to bind him with. And here 5 men trying to hold a little boy, or multiple grown men having to hold Ronald in our exorcist story last week. In the book of Acts chapter 19, I won't bring you through it all again, but we see a demonically possessed man harming others severely. He also had supernatural strength. He takes on 7 men all by himself and whoops them. This was in both cases as well, a little glimpse of it in the Zozo case. Is it possible to have multiple demons in one place? Yeah, I think that's pretty clear. Isaiah makes it clear, but the next question that we're going to answer will make the point even more apparent. Is it possible to have multiple demons in one person? Well, yes, this is demonstrated also by Mark 5. When Jesus asks the name of the entity, he says, "I am Legion, for we are many." This could be hundreds of spirits or simply hyperbole, but either way, it's bad, and there are multiple. We also see the answer is yes from Luke 8, verse 2, when we find out Mary Magdalene had 7 demons within her. If they can all be in one person, they can most certainly be in one place. Now, concerning things like the footprints and moving objects and the board relocating, those kinds of phenomena, what are we to make of those? Well, we know spiritual beings interacting with the physical world is totally possible, biblically speaking. A disembodied hand writes on a wall in Daniel 5 to the horror of King Belshazzar. Angels rolled the stone away from the mouth of Jesus' tomb, not to mention the angel that shows up in Peter's jail cell in Acts 12. He makes the chains fall off of Peter, he opens all the gates without touching them, and he walks Peter out of the jail and then just disappears. For those that say,
well, angels can do it, but that don't mean demons can do it.
I don't find that line of argument remotely compelling. Nothing indicates that a changing of allegiance changed their capabilities. In the same way that the changing of sides did not alter them in appearance either. I tell people that I believe Satan loves the ridiculous pop culture representation he's been given in the West. A mischievous, half-naked, red-skinned Keebler elf with a questionable mustache and a pitchfork. This ridiculous image is embedded in our minds, and it keeps us from seeing him when he really shows up disguised as an angel of light, as Paul warned. Even when these entities appear to us as our worst horror movie imaginings, it's not because that's what they actually look like, but it's merely the likeness they take on that will inspire the greatest fear in our hearts. No footprints or physical evidence has to even be left behind. No goo has to be left behind. When it does occur, it's entirely by choice so that they may instill fear in us. Too many treat paranormal investigation like detective work, and I know to some degree it is, but hear me out. In the same way that a detective comes on the scene and hopes that the culprit slipped up and left a fingerprint or a strand of hair, we stumble in hoping that a spirit slipped up and left a boot print or some goo on a blind, shows up in a mist or a glowing orb in a photograph. Like it was a mistake, like, oops, we caught him naked, we caught his mist form, like, come on. It's incredibly naive. I do believe that these things occur, but as I said, I believe them to be intentional every time. Undying beings that have existed for thousands of years know exactly what they are doing. They give just enough to keep people wondering and withhold just enough to maintain plausible deniability. I mentioned in the Warren episode that evidence of the paranormal will continue to be an elusive affair. I've often said we're dealing with intelligences, meaning to say we're dealing with intelligent beings. The word daimon in ancient Greek did not initially refer to inherently malevolent beings at all. Their initial use of the word was generalized. It referred to a spiritual entity or a divine power in general. It could be good or evil, the way that they initially used it. Plato and other Greek philosophers used the term to describe spirits and divine intelligences. As Hellenistic culture interacted with Judaism, namely during the Second Temple period, the term daimon began to take on negative connotations. In the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, we've talked a lot about that in the past, daimons were often associated with idolatry and the gods of pagan nations. Seen in places like Deuteronomy 32, which we already read, and Psalm 106:37. They sacrificed their sons and daughters to demons, and in the Septuagint it would say daimon. By the 1st century AD, when the New Testament is being written, the Greek word daimonion is consistently used to refer to the malevolent spiritual beings that oppose God and afflict his human image bearers. With the coming of Christ and the introduction of Christianity, the spiritual beings were exposed as enemies and tormentors. They are not neutral or wise intermediaries or spirit guides, though those in the occult and New Age spiritualism would like you to still think that. Daimons or demons are intelligent and malevolent beings seeking to pull people away from Yahweh, and now away from Yahweh incarnate, the Lord Jesus Christ. Acts 16 demonstrates that they can impart knowledge. A demonized slave girl in Philippi was found making a lot of money for her masters, and Paul commanded the spirit of divination within her to depart in the name of Jesus, and it did. Verse 19 indicates that she loses her powers of divination, thereby losing her ability to gain wealth for her owners. Acts 16:19 says. But when her owners saw that their hope of gain was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the rulers. So Paul and Silas were beaten and imprisoned for these things. I've told you the reasons for the prohibitions against divination in the Old Testament wasn't because it was fake, but because it was real. But it was also real evil, which is why God forbade it. In Acts 16 specifically, an interesting Greek phrase is used. The Greek phrase pneuma pythona translates to spirit of Python or Python spirit in English. In Greek mythology, the name Python refers to the serpent slain by Apollo at Delphi. Over time, the term came to be associated with the prophetic powers attributed to the Oracle of Delphi, which was thought to be inspired by the spirit of Python. The Delphic oracle's priestesses, known as the Pythia, were believed to channel prophetic messages from the gods, particularly Apollo, the one who subdued the python. Being that we're on the topic of wicked prophetic spirits, what are we to make of the evil spirit who identified itself as Zozo, who told Darren Evans' best friend Randy precisely how he was going to die? Did Zozo know the future? Did the python spirit truly give the Pythia the ability to know the future as well while we're at it? The Bible does not seem to indicate that spirits, good or evil, know the future. Yahweh is the Alpha and Omega. He alone is the beginning and end. He holds time in his hands and knows all things. But again, these spiritual beings have been around for millennia. They do have miraculous powers, but they have also become masters of human emotions and behaviors and patterns. If we're to consider the spirit of divination that had taken up residence in the slave girl in Acts, we have no idea how this happened. It's quite possible she sought it out like a medium. She could have been involved in the occult and was working with Irioni or knowing ones that we learned about. Imagine a spiritual being going around Philippi at night, not limited by walls and doors and other physical restrictions, gathering intel on the people of the city. And then the spirit returns to the woman and imparts this information to her. The following day, she could reveal that she has insights that she would have no other way of knowing. And now the people are hooked. Being that these intelligent beings have watched us for millennia, thousands of years, they don't need to predict the future. They know our patterns better than we do. If you think that's far-fetched, you have no idea what Facebook knows about you already. And not just from what you've revealed to it with your silly posts. Not to insult, I post on Facebook too. Their data can accurately predict when some of you are going to wake up, when you're going to bed, when you are going to poop, because it's when you open and close the app. Some of you do it so regularly, they gather that data and they slurp it up. I remember the first time my smartphone decided to direct me to a place I was going to, but that I hadn't yet put in the GPS. Kind of creeped me out. It's because at that time of day, on the same day, I always went to the same place, and the app knew that because of the data that it was gathering about me and my activities, and it knew where I was going before I left, and it creeped me out. That was a mindless app gathering information. What could an intelligent spiritual mind know and conclude about you when it can watch you and look over your shoulder 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? They can know far more about you than Mr. Zuckerberg, I assure you. Zozo negatively affected Randy's life because Randy gave it access as well. Darren and Randy were playing with the demonic Ouija board, and it opened them up to demonic influences. For those that would say,
Oh, he's blaming the victim.
I already told you before, if you play with gasoline next to an open flame and get caught on fire, I don't feel sorry for you. Unless you're a small child, these were grown men. The spirit did torment him, which most likely led to the alcoholism that contributed to the destruction of his marriage and his other opportunities. Was he cursed beyond this? We can't know for sure, but demons know of our vices and know how to use them against us. I would also like to point out Zozo, if that was the being's name, very easily could have told him when and how he was going to die, and then be the one to set up the circumstances of the death as well. He could have simply known that at the rate Randy was going, with the decisions he was making, probability said that he'd go out like this. Or he could have lit the fuse himself, because we know that spirits can influence the physical world whenever they want. Cause the car to malfunction like with Captain Austin in Indiana or Ed Warren in Connecticut. Heck, it wouldn't have even required that. Because no one got to ask Randy what happened that night, who's to say something didn't appear mysteriously in the middle of the road that sent his car careening into a tree at just the right moment? It definitely could have known his future if it knew it was going to do it to him. The other thing that I know you're wondering about all of this, can they know what we are thinking? Well, how did I know what you were thinking? Experience and behavior patterns are definitely part of it, right? But can they do more? This is an issue that has been debated by many scholars and theologians historically. I think many can display their arrogance and overconfidence when discussing this issue, to be honest. As I said before, intel gathering can do far more for them than we realize. But I do believe in instances of demonic possession, there is a strong possibility that they can know more about the thoughts of that individual. You cannot pretend to know the anatomy of demonic possession. We spoke about the nature of human existence. Was it dichotomous or trichotomous, right? Those were the two possibilities for our essence, right? Was it 2 parts or 3 parts? Are we body and soul, or body and spirit, or body, spirit, and soul? Are we 2 or are we 3? Remember, there are verses that make the distinction between the 2, and both Hebrew and Greek have separate language for both spirit and soul, so there is a strong possibility of the trichotomous view. If that's the case, where does the demon hang out? Your spirit, your soul, how does that work? You don't know, I don't know. When a demon takes possession of someone, where do they reside? Do they only gain access to the body? Do they gain access to the mind of the host as well? We don't have this laid out in Scripture, and too many pretend to know things that they don't. We know that they can take control of a person and force them to do things they otherwise would not do. Not just from our stories today, but from the pages of Scripture. I keep mentioning Mark chapter 5. Where does the mind even reside? Where does your will abide? Where do you dream? Oh, in my brain. Where in your brain? There's so much about the mind we don't know, and even more about the spirit and soul, or spirit and soul. There's so much we don't know. And all I'm saying is, let's approach them with humility. This gets real deep real fast, and we can quickly drown in the waves. I think a humble approach is necessary, that's all I'm saying. Admit what we don't know when we don't know it, or at least be willing to admit that we can't know for sure. They can seize control of individuals in ways that we do not and cannot understand. This can be made easier for them when we seek them out, and more still when we yield ourselves to them. This is where I want to propose the other big question that comes up when discussing this topic. Can a Christian be demonically possessed? This is another massive topic of debate among scholars and theologians. We often will draw hard lines and make distinctions between, say for instance, demonic possession and demonic oppression. I do feel these distinctions can be helpful and have their place, let me be clear. But I do find it interesting that some of the distinctions we make are rational, but not biblical. I don't mean that they are contrary to the Bible, I just mean that they are difficult to defend with the Bible definitively. But they make sense rationally. Because we like boxes and systems, we'll pick things up and we'll run with them. And sometimes it works, and sometimes we have to stretch before we reach. What do I mean by all this? The Bible uses a common word for demonic activity that lacks some of the clarity we'd like for it to have. The Greek word used in the New Testament, daimonizomai, this term is commonly translated as to be possessed by a demon or to be demon-possessed, though some scholars argue that to be afflicted by a demon is a better rendering, or to be demonized may be even more accurate, like the example we looked at previously where someone was made mute by a demon. There's no indication that there were all these other things going on with the self-harm and throwing their body around, but it is made very clear that once they were healed, that the demon was made to flee. The reason being is the word does not necessarily imply full possession in every case that it's used, but can indicate varying degrees of demonic influence and activity. Some scholars and theologians suggest that the translation, demon-possessed, may not fully capture the nuance of the Greek term, or the terms associated with it. Demonized is often proposed to indicate a spectrum of influence rather than total control. Can someone be demonized without being demon-possessed? Yes, I believe so. The focus in the New Testament is less on defining the exact nature of possession and more on Jesus' authority to deliver people from the forces of darkness, the demonic forces of darkness. When we consider cases like last week, we think of the demon as all the way in or all the way out. The demoniac of Mark seemed to be driven to destroy himself and totally controlled by an evil spirit that appears to have taken up full residence in him and caused him to do all manner of awful things. Whereas the demon-possessed slave girl of Philippi appeared to be used by an evil spirit that came in and out of her body until ultimately expelled by Paul. She got to maintain all her faculties as far as we know. She had a job, she was making her master's money, performing that job, and apparently doing it well because it sounds like they were rich, meaning they had repeat customers. I believe much of their activity depends upon who they are afflicting and why. What initiated this interaction between the human and the demon? Was it against their will? Was it with their will? Remember that you don't get to tell them what to do. Right? You don't get to tell them what to do, and even when you think you have control, it's only because they let you think you did. I believe much again of their activity depends on who they are afflicting and why and to what degree. Regardless of the specific activity, Jesus made it clear that the enemy comes to do what? Steal, kill, and destroy. But that still doesn't answer the question, does it? Can a Christian be possessed? Well, no. Definitely not in the traditional sense of the word, as we understand possessed. A demon cannot take up residence in a born-again, spirit-filled Christian, because another spirit, a superior spirit, the Holy Spirit, is already present within them. When Jesus was debating the topic of possession and exorcism in Luke chapter 11, he said this, verse 21 to 23. When a strong man, fully armed, guards his own palace, his goods are safe. But when one stronger than he attacks him and overcomes him, he takes away his armor in which he trusted and divides his spoil. Whoever is not with me is against me, and whoever does not gather with me scatters. Now in the passage, the kingdom of darkness is guarding what's theirs, but when one stronger than them attacks and overcomes, he takes what's theirs. Jesus was casting demons out of people and reclaiming them for the kingdom of God, for the kingdom of light. How can he do this? Because he is God, he is superior to all the powers of darkness combined. On the flip side, once you are his, you are filled with his Holy Spirit. So now, one greater than they is guarding what belongs to him. He's standing at the door of your heart, so to speak. He who is strong enough to save you is strong enough to keep you. But what about when a professing Christian toys with the powers of darkness? Think about this. A Christian battling with alcoholism can still get drunk if they're not careful, and probably should avoid certain places and people. A Christian battling with sexual immorality can still become lust addicted or physically afflicted with an STD or STI or worse. So yes, we have the Spirit of God, but we are not robots, and we do have wills, and we can still use them to choose things contrary to our new nature, things that can and will destroy us. So what about Christians battling with addiction or fascination with dark spiritual things? There will be significant issue for the professing believer that attempts to flirt with dark powers prohibited by God. If I'm in the car with the doors locked, the proverbial thief cannot come in and take the driver's seat. But what if I go right into an evil neighborhood and unlock the door? What then? Yes, I know this is an analogy and perhaps a weak one, but I hope you see the point I'm trying to make. Here's another point I want you to consider. It doesn't involve the occult or Ouija boards, but it's a potential Christian doing the unthinkable, and Peter has some really interesting things to say about it. In Acts chapter 5, we're all familiar with Ananias and Sapphira. When Peter finds out what he had done, and then he lies about it to his face, Peter says to him in Acts 5:3, Ananias, why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit and to keep back for yourself part of the proceeds of the land? Now the questions I have when I read that, is this literal? Is it figurative? Some will immediately rush to,
Well, Ananias wasn't a real Christian.
Where do you get off saying that?
Well, but he lied.
So let me get this straight. Have you lied since your conversion? Probably once or twice, right? Maybe more, right? Yes, he was made an example of early on when Satan sought to bring corruption into the early church. We don't know the state of his soul, though. All we know is that he allowed darkness to win. He allowed the dark thoughts to enter his heart, and he gave into them, and he paid for them dearly. Our best bet is to flee from darkness and immorality. not attempt to use some of it to our benefit like some ridiculous New Agers do who think that they know better than God. Setting up creepy altars, burning sage and sulfur while throwing salt everywhere is not a biblical practice. This is syncretism. This is the marrying of paganism with Christianity. Something, sadly, that the Catholic Church is insanely guilty of. I've given you a lot of kudos for believing in these realities and fighting against them. I'm heartbroken to know that, again, if all of the account of the Amon's family is true, and they went to other churches who closed the door in their face, that breaks my heart. The first time I heard this story, it was a story I heard a long time ago, and it made me like, man, that's awful. The church should be a place where they can find spiritual help, spiritual answers. But the anti-supernatural churches refuse to help them because of the ridiculous boxes that they've put themselves in. That's not cool. But Catholicism will let things into the box that don't belong in the box as well. And they have adapted many things, again, have nothing to do with biblical Christianity and nothing to do with the Bible. I feel like I bit off a little more than I could chew with this episode, or at least to put all of what I want to talk about in a single episode. I assure you I'm probably going to miss some points. I probably already have. We got to consider two more things before we wrap this up, though. And we might have to have a trilogy to cover everything. Maybe not. Yeah, I haven't decided yet. Maybe I'll give possession and demonization a break because I know that it can be really unsettling for some, and I don't blame you. So we'll see. I'll go follow me on social media, and you'll know before everybody else what we're going to cover in next week's episode. But the first thing that I want to touch on before we close pertains to this week and last. Some criticize the practice of exorcism because it doesn't resemble people's understanding of the casting out of demons from the Bible. They say that, well, Jesus commanded them once and they left and boom, it was over. Case closed. That's how it should be every time. To the Catholics whose toes are a little sore, I'm going to defend you now, whereas modern attempts seem to take multiple sessions at times. You're absolutely right that in the Bible, exorcisms performed by Jesus and some of the apostles appear to be instantaneous and decisive. That is a stark contrast to some modern practices which can involve extended and even repeated efforts. The Gospels show us that Jesus can cast out demons with unparalleled authority because he's the Son of God. Don't forget that though we're seeking to be like Jesus, we are not him. So there are things that he's going to do with ease that we cannot. When he commanded demons to leave, they had no choice but to obey instantly because he is Yahweh. He's Yahweh incarnate. He's Creator God. He shocked everyone in his day. Mark 1:27, he commands even the unclean spirits and they obey him. People were shook. We tend to think that exorcism is a Christian idea. It isn't. The sons of Sceva, the sons of a Jewish high priest in Acts, they were Jewish exorcists. The caves of Qumran were full of Jewish exorcistic material from the Second Temple period. Tons about demons and demonology and various practices that they had revolving around removing and warding off evil spirits. They believed in these things. Certain psalms were deemed exorcistic as well, Psalm 91 being a major one, a practice even pagans have ripped off, as we saw. I believe that modern deliverance and exorcisms are performed by humans relying on Christ's authority, but human frailty and spiritual resistance may lead to a more prolonged process for some. In the Bible, even the disciples encountered challenges in casting out certain demons. For instance, in Mark 9, verse 28 to 29, they struggled to drive out a demon until Jesus showed up and said that this kind can only come out by prayer and fasting. This shows that not all spiritual battles are instantaneous, even in biblical times. There are, power levels and authority levels on both sides of this conflict. This account in particular indicates that some demonic situations may require persistence, they may require spiritual preparation, i.e. the prayer and fasting, and they will always rely upon God and his strength, and at times even his timing. Deliverance ministry today often involves addressing deeper spiritual, psychological, and habitual issues. In many cases, deliverance isn't just about expelling a demon. It's about helping a person to break free from patterns of sin, of spiritual bondage, and maybe even trauma along the way. That process can take time as the person grows in faith and learns to rely upon God themselves. Exorcism is a part of a broader journey of healing and restoration, not just a single event. Whether a deliverance takes one session or multiple sessions, the key is that it's God who's ultimately going to deliver the person. The process may vary, but the source of victory is always going to be the same: Jesus Christ. I want to share a passage with you that shocked me when I saw it in a different light. I'd never noticed this before. I was shocked the day that I realized that not all miracles in the Bible happened instantaneously, as I had been led to believe. Guys like Johnny Mac will tell you, oh, nope, it was always instantaneous, it was right away, and don't get me wrong, I love me some Johnny Mac, but he is also heavily cessationist, and he really hates anything that is part of the Catholic Church, and I understand some of his issues, to be sure. This is not an attack on Johnny Mac, but yeah, he'll tell you, nope, it was always instantaneous, boom, first try, it was over, but that's not always the case. Did you know that? Well, let's find out. Did you know that even some of Jesus' miracles involved processes? You're thinking, wait, what? No. Yes, actually. Mark chapter 8, 22 to 25, we see Jesus heal a blind man, and the man's sight was restored gradually, not all at once. He did his miracle, and the guy could see a little bit, but it was blurry, and then he did it again, and then the guy could see all the way. This reveals that God can work in stages for reasons beyond our human understanding. It is His power and His prerogative all day, every day. Why did He do that miracle that way? Did He have to? Could He have done it instantaneously? I believe that. I would agree with Johnny Mac that He could. But He chose to do it in phases, in parts. Why? Interesting. I like to use that word by now. See, this would line up perfectly with the idea that extended deliverance does not necessarily contradict Scripture. I consistently remind you of the warnings that Jesus gave in Matthew 12 concerning deliverance from evil spirits. If they do leave and they return and find nothing in their place, they will bring friends, and the nightmare can continue, and worse than ever. If God delivers you from demons instantaneously or gradually, if you do not repent and believe in the Lord Jesus, you will remain spiritually vulnerable to demonization in the future. Now, one other side note that's a little more personal, but in this same vein of discussion. I don't have a Catholic background, but I do have, as a charismatic, a background that involved a so-called deliverance ministry. And I hope I've made it very clear that I believe that exorcism is real. The casting out of evil spirits is not only real, but necessary at times. I believe it's possible, and I believe that deliverance is a part of modern ministry today, but most deliverance ministries are very misled. I didn't say all, I said most. I went to a particular church that blamed a demon for everything. You're struggling with lust? Well, we got to cast out that lust devil from inside of you. And as a Christian, I'm thinking I'm loaded with demons because I'm battling with I'm a relatively new Christian, and I'm trying to figure out what it means to follow Him. And I'm thinking I'm full of demons, and there's a demon for everything there's a lying demon, and there's a lust demon, and I'm going up for prayer, and there's these long, obnoxious ceremonies. I got oil pouring off my bald head, and I'm feeling exactly the same every time I leave. But they're putting on this big show, like, oh, I can feel the demon. It's right here in your spine, and I feel it coming up. I'm not kidding. This is the kind of things that I saw. And as a new believer, I was initially fascinated, but then as I saw the fraud carry on, I was very upset. It was very upsetting. And I even contemplated walking away from the Lord, but it was the Lord that, of course, kept me and said, don't do that. John 8:32, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. It was pressing into God's word more so, not running from Him, but running to Him, where I saw, like, okay, these things are real, but they are also real easy to fake and to use to manipulate people and keep control over people. And I saw it, and I saw a lot of it, and it broke my heart. So fake deliverance ministries, again, they're not all fake, but many of them are very misled, trying to blame everything on a demon, and that's just not the case. That's one thing the Catholic Church does well, is they will investigate to see, is this a case of true demonic possession? And if so, we have a set way of how we're going to approach this. We're not going to call everything demonic possession, or we're not going to blame everything that a person is struggling with morally or physically or spiritually on a demon, because that's not how the Bible presents it either. So beware of those types of people and places as well. That is why the Holy Spirit is called a spirit of wisdom and a spirit of discernment. Last thing, then I'll shut up and let you lovely people get back to your day. Zozo, who is he? I don't know. Have a great day. Thank you for... No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Again, I remind you that demons are liars. Maybe it's his name, maybe it isn't. If the accounts are to be believed, and many who have dabbled in Ouija boards have had this experience, if it's not a name, it certainly appears to be a preferred moniker for a spirit that often afflicts those who use this evil tool of divination. I'm referring to a Ouija board. All of the accounts seem to involve Ouija boards, so that's just Zozo is connected to Ouija board cases. Zozo's often described as using multiple aliases or pretending to be someone else, such as a deceased loved one, a benevolent entity, or a famous individual, an influential individual. They say that Zozo is known for creating an atmosphere of dread or terror during interactions. It allegedly preys on the vulnerabilities of individuals, especially those struggling with perhaps fear or grief, even curiosity, because that's what drives many to this. That's one of the things that's scary about talking about any of these topics is making people curious about them. That's why I try really hard to balance it out with all the warnings that God gives in His Word about these things. Some reports include scratches or burns, other physical injuries that show up on the bodies of those who claim to have contact with Zozo. Also, some poltergeist-like activity can occur. Objects moving or falling are often connected to and attributed to Zozo. It is often reported that making threats or using vulgar, offensive language come with the manifestations. Accounts suggest that its interactions become increasingly hostile over time as well, especially if participants challenge or provoke it. A lot of this should sound familiar, not just from this week's story, but last week's episode as well. The case that inspired the Exorcist film began with the use of the same exact evil device employed by Darren Evans, the Ouija board. All of the things that people associate with Zozo were endured by Ronald in increasing measure. I kind of like that Darren has labeled it the Zozo phenomenon. I say that because I don't believe it to be a single entity at all, but rather a class of demonic entity. Divination is as old as time, folks, but the Ouija board is not. It's been around since 1890, and its siblings only like 20 years, or 16 to 20 years older than that. And I think there are spirits that have gravitated toward these devices, taking advantage of gullible, thrill-seeking people and paranormal enthusiasts. The Bible condemns divination in every way possible. If you want information from the other side, beloved, seek it from God and God alone. Go to any other means, and Zozo-like beings are eagerly waiting on the other side to bring chaos into your life, to steal, kill, and destroy, as Jesus warned in John 10. Some claim Zozo dates back to ancient times, attempting to link him to, Sumerian or Babylonian or early cultures back then, but there's no concrete evidence of this whatsoever. There's no mention of Zozo in the historical texts from these civilizations. Those that say, well, it must be Pazuzu, I'm like, did you stretch before that reach? I mean, just because some Z's are in there, let's switch out some vowels. I think a spirit could know the difference between a U and an O on a Ouija board. A lot of reason that this is suggested by people, I think, is tied to the Exorcist film. It planted the idea in people's heads because Pazuzu is the spirit that is working in Reagan in the Exorcist film. And Pazuzu and the Exorcist movie was the first movie to include a reference to a Ouija board historically as well. And this spirit from the movie is attached. But Pazuzu is an actual entity. Pazuzu is associated with Mesopotamian culture and mythology, which is why it was borrowed for the movie. But is the movie based on the actual pagan deity? No. There's nothing that they tried to pin it to historically other than, this sounds scary, right? and again, because of some Z's, it's a really big reach for me. That's not to say the idea isn't pretty old. It's just far from being that old. The earliest documented reference to the spirit of Zozo, or a reference to a spirit called Zozo, is from a French occultic text, Dictionnaire Infernal by Jacques-Colin Desplancés. I don't know if I said that right, I'm just making that pronunciation up, and it was in 1818. In it, a case is described of a girl who was possessed by multiple demons, including one that called itself Zozo. So it's just interesting. However, it's only a single mention from a single text, and one that predates the Ouija board by 72 years approximately. So it's not even like Zozo reports started emerging as around the same time as the board's creation. Just not the case. It's just not. Now, what about some of the symbology that gets associated with Zozo, the birds and stuff like that? Well, because there's no historical record of Zozo, connecting him to the birds can be quite difficult as well. And any attempts to connect him to other cultures is just really, really reaching. And I think that demons are aware that these similarities exist, and I think they plant even some of them, right? But what about the birds? What about, that's a really creepy detail, these jars of dead birds surrounded with rot. It's really gross, this vulgar imagery. Why? Well, creepy, demonic, occultic activity. That's all this is. Demons didn't put the dead birds in the jars. People did, and it was people that were pursuing dark things. And, well, I'm sure they found it. And I'm sure they tried to bury it. Well, it didn't work so well. People most likely put those birds in there and did so for nefarious purposes, dark spiritual purposes. Biblically speaking, birds are typically used as symbols for evil in the Bible, so it's no surprise that those involved in evil would use evil symbols. Bonus question for no extra charge. Do you need to know the name of a demon to cast it out, as suggested by many movies and priests and demonic accounts? I don't believe the answer is yes to that question at all. Now, the notion comes from Mark 5, when Jesus asked the name of the evil spirit or spirits occupying the man in the tombs, the demoniac. Multiple beings say, "My name is Legion, for we are many," right? But this is the only instance in which a name is requested by Jesus, or anyone else for that matter. We don't see this happen at any other time, and Mark is the gospel that contains the most demonic activity of all the gospels. If it were crucial, I kind of think it would be made more prevalent, but I'm open to be convinced otherwise. I also take issue with those that say, "Don't communicate with evil spirits in any way." But then in the same breath, they're all like, "Hey, what's your name?" It's like, wait, what? I thought I wasn't supposed to try and get any information from them. Oh, but getting their name is okay? How do you know they're going to even tell you the truth about that? It's just, it's silly to me. It's contradictory to me and unnecessary. I'm willing to be convinced otherwise, but I'd need some pretty compelling evidence to be convinced. The only name that matters in the unseen realm is the name that is above all names. It is the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. He alone has the power to deliver you from sin and from the powers of darkness, from the kingdom of darkness, to bring you into his kingdom of light. For those afflicted currently by the kingdom of darkness, and you don't understand why, plead with God for aid today. Ask him to show you potential blind spots and hidden sins. Ask him to reveal to you any openings in your spiritual life, past or present. Repent and ask him to deliver you. If you are still battling, know that Paul in 2 Corinthians 12 speaks of a messenger from Satan sent to buffet him. Many of you know it as the thorn in his flesh. When we are doing things for the kingdom of Christ, the kingdom of darkness places its crosshairs firmly upon us. Perhaps the adversity is something he wishes to deliver you from. Perhaps it's meant to buffet and humble you. Perhaps you do need to seek out further spiritual assistance from other members of the body of Christ to pray in agreement with you for deliverance from the spiritual affliction. I can't say, because I'm not there with you. If I was, I'd ask you more questions and we could talk about it and try and find it out together. If you are in Washington, then get at me, and I'd love to help. And I hope that this helps. I hope all of this did. I know that there are probably some details that I overlooked along the way. I bit off 2 stories. Probably should have only did one at a time, but I got really excited. I missed you guys last week. Was kind of lame for me. So I hope that helps, and I hope that you've enjoyed the show. I felt like I owed you after the last one. I know there is still more to discuss. I promise we'll get there. So many things, so little time, but I thank you from the bottom of my heart once again for joining me. As always, like, comment, follow, subscribe, and share. Do all the things wherever you consume the Dancing Toaster. But whatever you do, don't consume toasters, and don't use creepy Ouija boards you find under your house. I love you. I'm out.
Report suspicious activities and call 911 for immediate response. Expect delay.
Nobody else will be taken from the south. Stand by.
Flight 022, maintain approach. You're clear from
Expect traffic delays and restrictions. Take personal security precautions to avoid becoming a victim of an attack. Avoid crowded public areas and gatherings.
Roger, 527, maintaining 4,000, runway 8 kilo, holding.
Do not travel in areas time.
Be careful.
Government officials